Wretch, cried the Earl. An instinctive dread that you would do your poor charge some injury brought me back, and I thank heaven I have arrived in time to prevent your atrocious purpose. Your lordship would have acted more discreetly in staying away, replied Judith, recovering her resolution, and I would recommend you not to meddle in the matter, but to leave it to me. No suspicion shall alight on you, nor shall it even be known that her end was hastened. Leave the house as secretly as you came, and proceed on your journey with a light heart. She will never trouble you further. What? Exclaimed Rochester, who was struck dumb for the moment by surprise and indignation. Do you imagine I would listen to such a proposal? Do you think I would sanction her murder? I am sure you would, if you knew as much as I do, replied Judith, calmly. Hear me, my lord, she continued, drawing him to a little distance from the bed, and speaking in a deep low tone. You cannot marry Mistress Mallet while this girl lives. Rochester looked sternly and inquiringly at her. You think your marriage was feigned, pursued Judith, that he was no priest who performed the ceremony, and that no other witnesses were present except Sir George Etheridge and Pillicotty. But you are mistaken. I and Chowless were present, and he who officiated was a priest. The marriage was a lawful one, and yon sleeping girl, who, but for your ill-timed interference, would, ere this, have breathed her last, is to all intents and purposes Countess of Rochester. A lie, cried the Earl, furiously. I will soon prove it to be truth, rejoined Judith. Your retainer and unscrupulous agent, Major Pillicotty, applied to Chowless to find someone to personate a clergyman in a mock marriage, which your lordship wished to have performed, and promised a handsome reward for the service. Chowless mentioned the subject to me, and we speedily contrived a plan to outwit your lordship, and turn the affair to our advantage. The Earl uttered an ejaculation of rage. Being acquainted with one of the minor canons of St. Paul's, a worthy and pious young man named Vincent, pursued Judith, utterly unmoved by Rochester's anger, who resided hard by the cathedral, we hastened to him, and acquainted him with the design, representing ourselves as anxious to serve the poor girl, and defeat your lordship's wicked design, for such we termed it. With a little persuasion, Mr. Vincent consented to the scheme. Pillicotty was easily duped by Charles's statement, and the ceremony was fully performed. The whole story is a fabrication, cried the Earl, with affected incredulity. I have a certificate of the marriage, replied Judith, signed by Mr. Vincent, and attested by Chowless and myself. If ever woman was wedded to man, Amabel is wedded to your lordship. If this is the case, why seek to destroy her? Demanded the Earl. Her life must be of more consequence to you than her removal. I will deal frankly with you, replied Judith. She discovered me in the act of emptying that chest, and an irresistible impulse prompted me to make away with her. But your lordship is in the right. Her life is valuable to me, and she shall live. But, I repeat, you cannot marry the rich heiress, Mistress Mallet. Temptress, cried the Earl, you put frightful thoughts into my head. Go your ways, replied Judith, and think no more about her. All shall be done that you require. I claim as my reward the contents of that chest. Your reward shall be the gallows, rejoined the Earl, indignantly. I reject your proposal at once. Begone, wretch! Or I shall forget you are a woman, and sacrifice you to my fury. Begone! As your lordship pleases, she replied, but first, the Countess of Rochester shall be made acquainted with her rights. So saying, she broke from him, and rushed to the bed. What are you about to do? He cried. Waken her, rejoined Judith, slightly shaking the sleeper. Ah! exclaimed Amabel, opening her eyes, and gazing at her with a terrified and bewildered look. His lordship is returned, said Judith. "Indeed," exclaimed Amabel, raising herself in the bed. "Where is he? I see him not. Come to me, my dear lord," she added, stretching out her arms to him. "Come to me." But evil thoughts kept Rochester motionless. "Oh! Come to me, my lord," cried Amabel in a troubled tone, "or I shall begin to think what I have dreamed is true, and that I am not wedded to you." "It was merely a dream, your ladyship," observed Judith. "I will bear witness you are wedded to his lordship, for I was present at the ceremony." "I did not see you," remarked Amabel. "I was there, nevertheless," replied Judith. "I am sorry to hear it," replied Amabel. "Your ladyship would rejoice if you knew all," returned Judith, significantly. "Why so?" inquired the other, curiously. "Because the clergyman who married you is dead of the plague," was the answer, "and it may chance in these terrible times that the two gentlemen who were present at the ceremony may die of the same distemper, and then there will be no one left but me and another person to prove that your marriage was lawful." "But its lawfulness will never be questioned, my dear lord, will it?" asked Amabel, looking beseechingly at Rochester. "Never," replied Judith, producing a small piece of parchment, "while I hold this certificate." "Give me that document," said the Earl, in an undertone, to her. Judith directed her eyes towards the chest. "It is yours," said the Earl, in the same tone as before. "What are you whispering, my lord?" inquired Amabel, uneasily. "I am merely telling her to remove that chest, sweetheart," he replied. "Do not send it away," cried Amabel. "It contains all the ornaments and trinkets you have given me. Do you know," she added in a whisper, "I caught her looking into it just now, and I suspect she was about to steal something." "Pshaw!" cried the Earl, "she acted by my directions. Take the chest away," he added to Judith. "Has your lordship no further orders?" she rejoined, significantly. "None whatever," he replied, with a frown. "Before you go, give me the certificate," cried Amabel. "I must have it." Judith pretended not to hear her. "Give it her," whispered the Earl, "I will remove it when she falls asleep." Nodding acquiescence, Judith took the parchment from her bosom, and returned with it to the bed. While this was passing, the Earl walked towards the chest, and cast his eye over such of its contents as were scattered upon the floor. Judith watched him carefully, and when his back was turned, drew a small lancet, and affecting to arrange her dress, slightly punctured Amabel's neck. The pain was trifling, but the poor girl uttered a cry. "What is the matter?" cried the Earl, turning suddenly round. "Nothing, nothing," replied Judith. "A pin in my sleeve pricked her as I was fastening her cap, that was all. Her death is certain," she added to herself, "she is inoculated with the plague venom." She then went to the chest, and replacing everything within it, removed it, by the help of the Earl of Rochester, into the adjoining room. "I will send for it at midnight," she said. "It shall be delivered to your messenger," rejoined the Earl, "but you will answer for Charles's secrecy?" "I will," returned Judith, with a meaning smile. "But you may take my word for it you will not be troubled long with your wife. If I have any judgment respecting the plague, she is already infected." "Indeed," cried Rochester then, but he checked himself, and added, "I do not believe it." "Begone!" "He does believe it for all that," muttered Judith, as he slunk away. Rochester returned to Amabel, and sat by her until she fell asleep, when he took the parchment from beneath the pillow where she had placed it. Examining it, he found it, as Judith had stated, a certificate of his marriage, signed by Mark Vincent, the clergyman who had officiated, and duly attested. Having carefully perused it, he held it towards the taper, with the intention of destroying it. As he was about to perpetrate this unworthy action, he looked towards the bed. The soft sweet smile that played upon the sleeper's features turned him from his purpose. Placing the parchment in his doublet, he left the room, and summoning a female attendant, alleged some reason for his unexpected return, and ordered her to watch by the bedside of her mistress. Giving some further directions, he threw himself upon a couch and sought a few hours' repose. At daybreak, he repaired to Amabel's chamber, and finding her wrapped in a peaceful slumber, he commended her to the attendant, and departed. On awaking, Amabel complained of an uneasy sensation on her neck, and the attendant examining the spot, found, to her great alarm, a small red pustule. Without making a single observation, she left the room, and dispatched a messenger after the Earl of Rochester to acquaint him that the Countess was attacked by the plague. Such was the terror inspired by this dread disorder, that the moment it was known that Amabel was attacked by it, the whole household, except an old woman, fled. This old woman, whose name was Batley, and who acted as the Earl's housekeeper, took upon herself the office of nurse. Before evening, the poor sufferer, who had endured great agony during the whole of the day, became so much worse, that Mrs. Batley ran out in search of assistance. She met with a watchman, who told her that a famous apothecary, from Clerkenwell, named Sebald, who was celebrated for the cures he had effected, had just entered a neighboring house, and offered to await his coming forth, and send him to her. Thanking him, Mrs. Batley returned to the house, and presently afterwards, Sebald made his appearance. His looks and person had become even more repulsive than formerly. He desired to be led to the patient, and on seeing her, shook his head. He examined the pustule, which had greatly increased in size, and turning away, muttered, "I can do nothing for her." "At least make the attempt," implored Mrs. Batley. "She is the Countess of Rochester. You shall be well rewarded, and if you cure her, the Earl will make your fortune." "If his lordship would change stations with me, I could not cure her," replied Sebald. "Let me look at her again," he added, examining the pustule. "There is a strange appearance about this tumor. Has Judith Malmains attended her?" "She was here yesterday," replied Mrs. Batley. "I thought so," he muttered. "I repeat, it is all over with her." And he turned to depart. "Do not leave her thus, in pity do not," cried the old woman, detaining him. "Make some effort to save her. My lord loves her to distraction, and will abundantly reward you." "All I can do is to give her something to allay the pain," returned Sebald. And drawing a small phial from his doublet, he poured its contents into a glass, and administered it to the patient. "That will throw her into a slumber," he said, "and when she wakes, she will be without pain. But her end will be not far off." Mrs. Batley took a purse from a drawer in one of the cabinets, and gave it to the apothecary, who bowed and retired. As he had foretold, Amabel fell into a heavy lethargy, which continued during the whole of the night. Mrs. Batley, who had never left her, noticed that an extraordinary and fearful change had taken place in her countenance, and she could not doubt that the apothecary's prediction would be realized. The tumor had increased in size, and was surrounded by a dusky brown circle, which she knew to be a bad sign. The sufferer's eyes, when she opened them, and gazed around, had a dim and glazed look. But she was perfectly calm and composed, and, as had been prognosticated, free from pain. She had, also, fully regained her faculties, and seemed quite aware of her dangerous situation. But the return of reason brought with it no solace. On the contrary, the Earl's treachery rushed upon her recollection, and gave her infinitely more anguish than the bodily pain she had recently endured. She bedewed the pillow with her tears, and fervently prayed for forgiveness for her involuntary fault. Mrs. Batley was deeply moved by her affliction, and offered her every consolation in her power. "I would the plague had selected me for a victim instead of your ladyship," she said. It is hard to leave the world at your age, possessed of beauty, honors, and wealth. At mine, it would not signify. You mistake the cause of my grief, returned Amabel. I do not lament that my hour is at hand, but, and her emotion so overpowered her that she could not proceed. Do not disturb yourself further, dear lady, rejoined the old woman. Let the worst happen. I am sure you are well prepared to meet your Maker. I once was, replied Amabel in a voice of despair, but now, oh, heaven forgive me! Shall I fetch some holy minister to pray beside you, my lady? Said Mrs. Batley, one to whom you can pour forth the sorrows of your heart? Do so. Oh, do, cried Amabel, and do not call me lady. I am not worthy to be placed in the same rank as yourself. Her wits are clean gone, muttered Mrs. Batley, looking at her compassionately. Heed me not, cried Amabel, but if you have any pity for the unfortunate, do as you have promised. I will, said Mrs. Batley, departing. Half an hour, which scarcely seemed a moment to the poor sufferer, who was employed in fervent prayer, elapsed before Mrs. Batley returned. She was accompanied by a tall man, whom Amabel recognized as Solomon Eagle. I have not been able to find a clergyman, said the old woman, but I have brought a devout man who is willing to pray with you. Ah, exclaimed the enthusiast, starting as he beheld Amabel. Can it be Mr. Blondel's daughter? It is, returned Amabel with a groan. Leave us, my good woman, she added to Mrs. Batley, I have something to impart to Solomon Eagle which is for his ear alone. The old woman instantly retired, and Amabel briefly related her hapless story to the enthusiast. May I hope for forgiveness? She inquired, as she concluded. Assuredly, replied Solomon Eagle, assuredly. You have not erred willfully, but through ignorance, and therefore have committed no offense. You will be forgiven, but woe to your deceiver, here and hereafter. Oh, say not so, she cried. May heaven pardon him as I do. While I have strength left I will pray for him. And she poured forth her supplications for the Earl in terms so earnest and pathetic, that the tears flowed down Solomon Eagle's rough cheek. At this juncture, hasty steps were heard in the adjoining passage, and the door opening, admitted the Earl of Rochester, who rushed towards the bed. Back, cried Solomon Eagle, pushing him forcibly aside. Back! What do you hear? Cried Rochester, fiercely. I am watching over the deathbed of your victim, returned Solomon Eagle. Retire, my lord. You disturb her. Oh, no, returned Amabel, meekly. Let him come near me. And as Solomon Eagle drew a little aside, and allowed the Earl to approach, she added, with my latest breath I forgive you, my lord, for the wrong you have done me, and bless you. The Earl tried to speak, but his voice was suffocated by emotion. As soon as he could find words, he said, Your goodness completely overpowers me, dearest Amabel. Heaven is my witness, that even now I would make you all the reparation in my power were it needful. But it is not so. The wrong I intended you was never committed. I myself was deceived. I intended a feigned marriage, but it was rightfully performed. Time will not allow me to enter into further particulars of the unhappy transaction, but you may credit my assertion when I tell you you are indeed my wife, and Countess of Rochester. If I thought so, I should die happy, replied Amabel. Behold this proof, said Rochester, producing the certificate. I cannot read it, replied Amabel. But you could not have the heart to deceive me now. I will read it, and you well know I would not deceive you, cried Solomon Eagle, casting his eye over it. His lordship has avouched the truth, he continued. It is a certificate of your marriage with him, duly signed and attested. God be thanked, ejaculated Amabel, fervently. God be thanked. You have been spared that guilt, and I shall die content. I trust your life will long be spared, rejoined the Earl. Amabel shook her head. There is but one man in this city who could save her, whispered Solomon Eagle, and I doubt even his power to do so. Who do you mean? Cried Rochester, eagerly. Dr. Hodges, replied the enthusiast. I know him well, cried the Earl. I will fly to him instantly. Remain with her till I return. My lord, my dear lord, interposed Amabel, faintly, you trouble yourself needlessly. I am past all human aid. Do not despair, replied the Earl. Many years of happiness are, I trust, in store for us. Do not detain me. I go to save you. Farewell for a short time. Farewell, forever, my lord, she said, gently pressing his hand. We shall not meet again. Your name will be coupled with my latest breath. I shall be completely unmanned if I stay here a moment longer, cried the Earl, breaking from her, and rushing out of the room. As soon as he was gone, Amabel addressed herself once more to prayer with Solomon Eagle, and in this way an hour passed by. The Earl not returning at the end of that time, Solomon Eagle became extremely uneasy, every moment being of the utmost consequence, and summoning Mrs. Batley, committed the patient to her care, and set off in search of Hodges. He hastened to the doctor's house, he was absent, to St. Paul's, he was not there, but he learnt that a person answering to the Earl's description had been making similar inquiries after him. At last, one of the chirurgeon's assistants told him that he thought the doctor was gone towards Cornhill, and hoping, accidentally, to meet with him, the enthusiast set off in that direction. While passing near the exchange, he encountered Leonard, as before related, but did not think fit to acquaint him with more than Amabel's dangerous situation, and he had reason to regret making the communication at all, on finding its effect upon the poor youth. There was, however, no help for it, and placing him in what appeared a situation of safety, he left him. Rochester, meanwhile, had been equally unsuccessful in his search for Hodges. Hurrying first in one direction and then in another, at the suggestion of the chirurgeon's assistant, he at last repaired to the doctor's residence, determined to await his return. In half an hour he came, and received the Earl, as the old porter stated to Thirlby and Leonard, with angry astonishment. As soon as they were alone, the Earl told him all that had occurred, and besought him to accompany him to the poor sufferer. I will go to her, said Hodges, who had listened to the recital with mixed feelings of sorrow and indignation, on one condition, and one only, namely, that your lordship does not see her again without my permission. Why do you impose this restriction upon me, sir? Demanded Rochester. I do not think it necessary to give my reasons, my lord, returned Hodges, but I will only go upon such terms. Then I must perforce submit, replied the Earl, but I entreat you to set forth without a moment's delay, or you will be too late. I will follow you instantly, rejoined Hodges. Your lordship can wait for me at the Southwark side of the bridge. He then opened the door, reiterating the terms upon which alone he would attend, and the Earl departed. Shortly afterwards he set out, and making the best of his way, found Rochester at the appointed place. The latter conducted him to the entrance of the habitation, and indicating a spot where he would remain till his return, left him. Hodges soon found his way to the chamber of the sufferer, and at once perceived that all human aid was vain. She exhibited much pleasure at seeing him, and looked round, as if in search of the Earl. Guessing her meaning, the physician, who now began to regret the interdiction he had placed upon him, told her that he was the cause of his absence. It is well, she murmured, well. She then made some inquiries after her relatives, and receiving a satisfactory answer, said, I am glad you are come. You will be able to tell my father how I died. "It will be a great comfort to him to learn the tranquil frame in which I have found you," replied Hodges. "How long have I to live?" asked Amabel, somewhat quickly. "Do not deceive me." "You had better make your preparations without delay," returned Hodges. "I understand," she replied, and joining her hands upon her breast, she began to murmur a prayer. Hodges, who up to this moment had had some difficulty in repressing his emotion, withdrew to a short distance to hide his fast-falling tears. He was roused shortly after, by a sudden and startling cry from the old woman. "Oh, sir, she is going!" "She is going!" ejaculated Mrs. Batley. He found the exclamation true. The eyes of the dying girl were closed. There was a slight quiver of the lips, as if she murmured some name, probably Rochester's, and then all was over. Hodges gazed at her sorrowfully for some time. He then roused himself, and giving some necessary directions to the old woman respecting the body, quitted the house. Not finding the Earl at the place he had appointed to meet him, after waiting for a short time, he proceeded towards his own house. On the way he was met by Thirlby and Paravison, as previously related, and conducted to the house in Nicholas Lane. It will not be necessary to recapitulate what subsequently occurred. We shall, therefore, proceed to the point of time when he quitted his new patient, and entered the room where Thirlby and Leonard were waiting for him. Both, as has been stated, rushed towards him, and the former eagerly asked his opinion respecting his daughter. "My opinion is positive," replied Hodges. "With care, she will undoubtedly recover." "Heaven be thanked," cried Thirlby, dropping on his knees. "And now, one word to me, sir," cried Leonard. "What of Amabel?" "Alas," exclaimed the doctor, "her troubles are ended." "Dead!" shrieked Leonard. "Aye, dead," repeated the doctor. "She died of the plague tonight." He then proceeded to detail briefly all that had occurred. Leonard listened like one stupefied, till he brought his recital to a close, and then asking where the house in which she had died was situated, rushed out of the room, and made his way, he knew not how, into the street. His brain seemed on fire, and he ran so quickly that his feet appeared scarcely to touch the ground. A few seconds brought him to London Bridge. He crossed it, and turning down the street on the left, had nearly reached the house to which he had been directed, when his career was suddenly checked. The gate of the courtyard was opened, and two men, evidently, from their apparel, buriers of the dead, issued from it. They carried a long narrow board between them, with a body wrapped in a white sheet placed upon it. A freezing horror rooted Leonard to the spot where he stood. He could neither move nor utter a cry. The men proceeded with their burden towards the adjoining habitation, which was marked with a fatal red cross and inscription. Before it stood the dead cart, partly filled with corpses. The foremost burier carried a lantern, but he held it so low that its light did not fall upon his burden. Leonard, however, did not require to see the body to know whose it was. The moon was at its full, and shed a ghastly light over the group, and a large bat wheeled in narrow circles round the dead cart. On reaching the door of the house, the burier set down the lantern near the body of a young man which had just been thrust forth. At the same moment, Challis, with a lantern in his hand, stepped out upon the threshold. "Who have you got, Jonas?" he asked. "I know not," replied the hindmost burier. "We entered yon large house, the door of which stood open, and in one of the rooms found an old woman in a fainting state, and the body of this young girl, wrapped in a sheet, and ready for the cart. So we clapped it on the board, and brought it away with us." "You did right," replied Challis. "I wonder whose body it is." As he spoke, he held up his lantern, and unfastening it, threw the light full upon the face. The features were pale as marble, calm in their expression, and like those of one wrapped in placid slumber. The long fair hair hung over the side of the board. It was a sad and touching sight. "Why, as I am a living man, it is the grocer's daughter, Amabel, Sumwell Countess of Rochester," exclaimed Chowless. It is," cried the Earl, suddenly rushing from behind a building where he had hitherto remained concealed. "Whither are you about to take her?" Set her down, set her down." "Hinder them not, my lord," vociferated another person, also appearing on the scene with equal suddenness. "Place her in the cart," cried Solomon Eagle, for he it was, to the bearers. "This is a just punishment upon you, my lord," he added to Rochester, as his injunctions were obeyed. "Oppose them not in their duty." It was not in the Earl's power to do so. Like Leonard, he was transfixed with horror. The other bodies were soon placed in the cart, and it was put in motion. At this juncture, the apprentice's suspended faculties were for an instant, and an instant only, restored to him. He uttered a piercing cry, and staggering forward, fell senseless on the ground.